Okay, so this is a video lecture in place of class to act as a follow-up to the lecture on industrialization that we had last time, and talk about some of the things that are going on in Western culture particularly, and which to some extent will wind up being replicated out in other cultures as they industrialize over the course of the 19th century. Okay, so previously you've had a lecture on industrialization. Now we're going to talk about some of the sort of social and cultural results coming off of it. Um, One thing I've put in one of the video lectures, but not in all of the live classroom lectures, so I'll make sure I mention it now. You see some new forms of institutional organization associated with the rise of the new industrial economies that are going to be very significant. Part of it is going to be aspects of the way that business itself is organized. Um, you tend to see the joint stock corporation as a model, same sort of thing we saw with colonial corporations and the East India companies, really expanding and becoming much larger and happening on a larger scale than you had previously seen elsewhere. Um, doesn't happen so much in first wave industrialization in Britain. An individual factory is pretty much a self-contained business unto its own, although some of them will sell stock and become public that way. But it's really in the second wave of industrialization and rolling over into the third that you really see this happening on a large scale. And that's because the railroads are, by nature, not something that can be run very well as a single business out of a single location, right? And so, therefore, sort of hard to do as a single businessman's enterprise under his private ownership or in a small scale partnership. Can do that with a factory. With a railroad, though, you need properties and offices in multiple cities spread over multiple states or provinces, often over an entire country. Um, you have a whole lot of complex operations to handle as far as scheduling, running the trains, maintaining things, customer service going on, selling tickets, loading freight, all these different kinds of things. Much, much larger scale, complex kinds of operations going on in order to keep a railroad running compared to what used to be necessary just to run a factory, let alone other kinds of, local mercantile enterprises that had previously been the case. So joint stock corporations are going to become much, much larger and grow into these kind of conglomerate type of operations. Um, the other thing is, particularly as you get into that third wave of industrialization, you're going to see a process called vertical integration. Andrew Carnegie, who is Scottish but makes his fortune in the Americas, in the United States, is a classic example of this. Basically, Carnegie, he starts off in railroads and then he goes into the steel industry, and he's taking that sort of complex business model from the railroads and thinking about how it can be used in other areas. He goes into the steel industry, which kind of serves the railroad industry, and he realizes on the one hand, you'll have one business where a guy's operating a mine to generate iron ore, and then you have somebody who is running a business transporting that ore by train or barge or something to a refinery, and then the refinery will be a business unto itself, and then there'll be more transportation to move the refined steel to a factory that's going to make it into beams or sheets or whatever products are then going to go on to be sold to somebody else. Um, Carnegie's idea is to say, what if this were all one company? What if you took your refinery and your profits from it and you bought up the transportation assets and the transportation businesses? And what if you then bought your own mine? Right? And what if you bought your own factory? And what if you had this whole integrated process where one conglomerated corporation is doing the mining and the transporting of the ore and running the refinery and transporting the refined steel to factories and doing the actual manufacturing, and that was all one company. You'd have something that'd be much more efficient. You could save a lot of money, and that would mean you could lower your prices while still keeping up your profits, which will enable you to drive your competitors out of business and launch hostile takeovers of their companies and make your company even bigger, integrate more, and go on and on and on like that. So Carnegie kind of pioneers this, large scale conglomerate corporation, more efficient production, larger profits getting made. Carnegie sort of, you start getting this breed of sort of captains of industry who are, just building these enormous commercial empires out of their various companies that they're integrating in this kind of a way, and this becomes a major, very, 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 very big deal and somewhat controversial. Obviously, it's a very aggressive way of doing business. It's, not particularly nice, to say the least, and a lot of people do object to it, particularly people who are being, forced out of competition. You'll start getting government attention on this kind of issue. By the time we get to the 20th century, people talk about antitrust laws and things like that. But anyway, the sort of conglomerated corporation becoming, much more prominent in the economy as you move through the 19th century, or at least towards the end of the 19th century. Another thing is also the merchant bank. Don't need to worry about that too much, or investment bank, moving away from sort of all-purpose banking and new kinds of banks emerging specifically for the sake of investing in the new kinds of industrial production and making sure that people can have the capital that they need to be able to invest in expanded railroads or new mining or new factories or what have you. So that some sort of new dimension of complexity in the finance industry. And then there's also from the workers' side, all this industrial production is, hiring people for wages, and you start getting naturally people attempting to make more money by reducing their costs, which means they're going to start squeezing the workers more and more. And as they do that, the workers naturally are going to get very worried about their own position for reasons we'll talk about in a minute. They're in a very vulnerable and kind of fragile economic position. And so what you start seeing is the growth of a union movement, especially in the second half of the 19th century, where workers will start to band together into unions in order to engage in collective bargaining. They will go on strikes, work stoppage to protest low wages or bad treatment. Their working conditions, there's really no safety regulations in place. You have children working in the factories in the early 19th century and such. So there's a sort of political dimension and a legislative dimension going on to it, as well as just sort of a test of strength and negotiation between the management and owners of factories and railroads and such over against the workers there. You still have a lot of that hierarchical culture in place, which causes the union movement also to be highly controversial. You sort of a sense of outrage that sort of people on the bottom of the social scale would question their betters or challenge their superiors and go around making all these demands, rather than staying in their proper places, working submissively. But the union movement does gather steam and does become an enduring feature and becomes, a new institutional dimension of the marketplace by the end of the 19th century that hadn't really existed beforehand. So things like that are very significant new developments that are going on. Okay, so that's sort of on the institutional side. Okay, let's talk more in terms of social structure. Let's talk class, right? Something that the Marxists are very concerned about. Um, Industrialization really marks a transformation of the class structure of industrial societies. Um, it's possible to draw any society as a pyramid, right? We've done that, we did that back at the beginning and sort of pointed out, there's always a small number of wealthy, powerful people at the top and a large number of relatively poor, less powerful people at the bottom, and a group of people you can kind of put in the middle. That's normal in every kind of society. Not very useful to really understanding society. The real question is what makes the top people be at the top? What makes the bottom people be at the bottom? What are the characteristics of the people in the middle? What are the actual details of it? So in early modern society, drawing from medieval society, certainly in Europe and really true a lot of places, the lower class was largely an agricultural peasantry. The middle class was a class of merchants and craftsmen working in the towns. The upper class was a class of land-owning nobles and royalty. Right. Um, Industrialization is going to change that a lot. The new Let me do it the reverse direction. The new upper class that's going to emerge is going to be what we call a capitalist class. Okay, they are characterized not by noble birth, not by military traditions and knighthood, not by legal privilege. By this time, you've had enough liberalism coming off the French Revolution, such that generally everybody is theoretically equal under the law, um, and not by agricultural land owning. Right? But instead, they are going to be characterized by their ownership of the companies which are sort of, now the main engines of economic activity, the factories, the railroads, the steamship lines, the merchant banks, and so forth, right? So a capitalist class which is making their money off of their investments, right? There's sort of lots of stocks, lots of bonds, lots of investments in all these various banks and enterprises, and they're essentially, managing their portfolios, and that's how they make their living. Okay, so capitalist class. One huge question for this new upper class is, what is its relationship to the old upper class, right? What happened to the old nobles and so forth of Europe? Where did they go, and who are these new capitalists? The older tradition in history tended to think that what's going on here is that the capitalist class is coming out of the medieval middle class, right? That the merchants and craftsmen are going up the ladder and becoming wealthier and becoming capitalists, and the nobles are kind of becoming obsolete and dying off and kind of falling by the wayside. More recent scholarship has suggested that actually that's not entirely the case. You do get upward mobility, you do get people, and Andrew Carnegie is a great example. What used to be medieval, early modern, middle class, merchant class kinds of people who become wealthy and invest and sort of, make the jump out of the middle class into the upper class and become the new capitalists. That definitely does happen. But for the most part, the old nobility is not all that stupid. They can see what's going on. They can see the new ways that are out there for money to get made. And they've already got quite a bit of wealth being generated off of their traditional agricultural landholding, all the rents and things they collect from the peasantry. Um, so, to a great extent, in traditional European countries, at least like England and France and Germany, the capitalist class is to a great extent descended from the older noble class, right? Some of them continue to have titles of nobility. Some of them are intermarrying with new wealthy families, wealthy individuals rising up from the merchant classes. You get a kind of a blending, but the new capitalist class is going to be a blend of the old nobility and rising merchant class type of people who are, making it to the top of the ladder that way. Okay, so that's one group of people. Middle class is also going to be changing. Those old middle class people had been, remember, sort of your merchants and your craftsmen. Well, as factories take over, craftsmanship in the home is no longer going to be terribly important as a sector of the economy anymore. That's going to start fading out. Mercantile activity, likewise, is going to be less a matter of the trader with a ship going around from port to port buying and selling things. It's going to be more swept up into this corporate model. The new middle class is going to be largely a management class. Okay, so the upper class were owning the factories and making a living, making their wealth off of their investments in the economy. The new middle class is going to be largely a management class, and they are going to be making their money on a salary, getting paid to them by the owners of the factories, right? So they're getting paid a salary, which means they've got a fixed monthly, annual rate of pay, very reliable, very stable. These are the guys with the clipboards. These are the guys sitting in the offices doing the managing. We talk about them as white-collar workers, and their job is overseeing the operations of the railroad, the factory, the bank, the what have you. They don't own it, but they're in charge of, doing the day-to-day running of it in the way that the upper class doesn't do. The other component of the middle class is going to be a group of people who had always been there back to the Middle Ages, though now you're going to see them in greater numbers, and that's a professional class. Here we're using professional in the sense of people whose ability to make a living is based on their expertise in some sort of a specialized field. These are lawyers, doctors, accountants, people like that. Okay, so professional class of those sort of people also basically functioning within this middle class kind of an environment. Um, Okay, so characterized by wage labor, also characterized by things like home ownership is going to be sort of a key thing, and we'll talk about other things that are sort of marks of middle class respectability, so to speak. Okay. Um, all right, so upper class, capitalist class, living off of investments, middle class, management and professionals living on salaries. And then you've got your lower class, which is going to be a working class, a laboring class. You still have farming out there. It doesn't disappear, but of course it's become much less important as an overall component of the economy. But really the increasingly what's most important for the lower tier of society is going to be the factory workers, railroad workers, we would call blue collar kinds of workers. Um, And the main difference here, sort of, as far as sort of characteristics that mark somebody out as working class versus middle class, what's the difference, is that where the middle class was generally being paid a salary, sort of a annual fixed amount of money, maybe with a bonus or something, but basically fixed, which would get, divvied up week by week or month by month or what have you. The working class is getting paid an hourly wage. Okay, you get a set amount of money per hour that you work. The more hours you work, the more money you get paid. The less hours you work, the less money you get paid, right? And that's sort of a key characteristic there. Because what it means is that the laboring class is very vulnerable to shifts in the market, right? Um, if the factory is not selling as many goods, if they slow things down, they'll start to cut people's hours, right? Um, Middle class is not so much affected by that. They're still collecting their salary. They still just, show up at the office, put in their however many hours a day, and then, go home and collect their salary. But the factory floor workers, right, the blue collar guys, if they have their hours cut, then they're walking home with less money at the end of a week, or they're much more vulnerable to fluctuations in their pay, in a way that the middle class is not really all that vulnerable to. And the capitalist class, they're making less money, of course, if there's a slowdown, but they're going from being super rich to just being rich. Sort of, they're not worried about being out on the street. Um, but laboring class people are very, very vulnerable to fluctuations in wages. When there's a lot of work, then wages go up, and there's lots of hours available, and you bring in a lot of money. The economy slows down, and then all of a sudden you're not getting as many hours, you're not bringing as much money, it starts getting harder to pay the bills or even to feed yourself or your family sometimes. So that's kind of the mark there, that sort of fluctuation and that sense of vulnerability. Um, Okay, the other thing economically, which I alluded to with the middle class, is that whereas the middle class would typically own their own homes, they're able to afford that on a salary. The laboring class generally does not. They're generally living in tenements. They're generally renting flats, apartments, what have you, from real estate investors, often themselves capitalists of some stripe. Sometimes you'll actually have sort of the factory housing that the capitalists have built in order to accommodate the workers they need to bring in to work in their factories. So they're also renting homes to these people at the same time as they're employing them in the factories. Can be very integrated. Some of the better capitalists sort of have this paternalistic, benevolent sense of we're going to provide subsidized housing and entertainments and, all these benefits to our workers, and it's going to be a very nice arrangement. Other times, though, you will have much less benevolent people who will use this arrangement to sort of make the workers dependent on them, and then, if you go on strike, you're going to get kicked out of your home, or you're not going to be able to leave work because, to take another job because we're going to, run you into debt because you have to use the factory store, or you have to, rent the factory housing or something. So you have both benevolent and malevolent, uses this kind of thing. But, again, that kind of vulnerability comes in, which helps us understand, what the unions are being formed in order to wrestle with. Um, Okay, so that's sort of, thinking about changes in the class structure, going away from your old nobility, merchant class, peasantry, into an arrangement of, capitalist management, middle class, capitalist upper class, management middle class, and, laboring wage earning lower class. Okay, so that's a few factors of what's going on here. Now, we could start transitioning from economy and social structure over into culture. As a result of that. And let's again kind of maybe do this from the top down to think about what this is going to mean. The capitalist class is going to be very competitive, right? People sort of, wanting to say, we're on top, status is going to be very important. A lot of these people, remember, there is social mobility. There is a lot of anxiety on the part of those from noble backgrounds, noble ancestry to, remind people of their, their past, the legacy of their families. Going to be even more anxiety on the part of merchant class people who have risen there to sort of say that they belong in this upper class kind of a way, and they're going to look for ways to do that. What this is going to lead to is a culture that we call conspicuous consumption. Okay, conspicuous consumption. What does conspicuous consumption mean? Well, consumption means buying things, right? Spending money on things of various kinds. Um, Conspicuous means spending money publicly, spending money in ways that people will see and observe, so that they understand that you were able to spend that money on something. Okay, you sort of think of it this way, a kind of example that might be familiar to many of you. If you think about designer jeans, big, top label, clothing, jeans one might go and buy at the mall. Um, you might have a pair of jeans that you could buy, for cheap at Walmart for 20 bucks or something, and then you might have a pair of designer jeans in a boutique store that will cost 10 times that much, $200. And so the question is, okay, why do the boutique jeans cost 10 times as much as the cheap jeans do? Um, well, part of it might be rational considerations of the quality. They may be better designed, they may look better, they may be more comfortable, they may last longer, whatever. All these things may be valid considerations, but will they last 10 times as long? Do they look 10 times as good? Can you even rationally measure a consideration like that? Probably not. Normally, if you sort of do a rational calculation of, the sheer quality of the good, you might say it's 50% better, twice as good, 3 times as good, 10 times as good. Maybe not. Um, so why do they cost 10 times as much? Well, for the label that's on them, right? In other words, they cost 10 times as much so that people who see you wearing them will know that you are the kind of person who could buy the jeans that cost 10 times as much. Right? The price becomes self-justifying. You spend the money so that other people can see that you spent the money and that you are capable of doing so, right? It's a way you assert status. It's a way that you make a claim about where you belong on the social ladder. And I'm sure you've all been to high school. You know people do this. Same thing is going on in the 19th century in the capitalist class, right? These ultra-rich people who are, owning stock in all the corporations and factories and railroads and things need ways to show each other that they are, in fact, in the upper class, and they get this kind of competitive keeping up with the Joneses thing going on. So conspicuous consumption takes on. People talk about the sort of motto of the era, especially the second half of the 19th century, being that too much is never enough. You don't only have your home, but you have your country home. You have your yacht. Your home becomes this mansion, much larger than you actually need to live in. You've got servants working in it, far more than you actually need to work for you. But the sheer fact that you have such a large serving staff shows that you can afford such a large serving staff. All these kinds of things. Another dimension to conspicuous consumption, so it's just a whole lot of flashy expenditure, as sort of conspicuous consumption is something you can see all through history in many different societies. It generally happens in periods where you have more rapid social change going on and therefore more social anxiety, more status anxiety. People start worrying about, is their status stable, and therefore they start making an effort to spend more and display more in order to assert where they belong on the social hierarchy. Um, okay, so that's one dimension there. Another area in which you can see conspicuous consumption going on actually responds to the very anxieties and insecurities and criticisms that come out of all this industrial and capitalist development. Um, excuse me. And there, like we've been saying, guys like Carnegie, they're launching hostile takeovers. You've got a lower class that's getting, very squeezed often and is feeling a need to unionize, is, naturally, potentially critical of the big bosses on top and so forth. And so you need some kind of an effort to display that actually all this money that you're making does serve some good purpose, that it is for the good of society that you are so very, 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 very rich. Okay. Um, and so you could also get conspicuous consumption in ways which are calculated to work for the good of society, and sometimes quite sincerely, trying to do good for society out of, gratitude for how well they've done, but also in order to sort of fend off criticisms of your business practices or of, of the inequality of wealth. So you get philanthropy being very widespread. And Carnegie, again, I keep on coming back to him, but he's a great example of this kind of a thing. In other words, you take your money and you start endowing colleges and universities, right? If you sort of go around the United States in particular, look at the names of so many of our institutions of higher education, the private ones in particular, and many of them are named for some benefactor. Or if the whole campus isn't, then there's a dorm that is. There's a dining hall, there's a library. And these all, carry the names of wealthy capitalists who donated the money for these things to be set up for the good of scholarship and education. Museums will be set up on the same kind of a basis. Libraries will be set up on the same kind of a basis. Hospitals, charitable enterprises. Lots of these different kinds of things. If you look around for Carnegie's name, you'll find it all over. You'll find Carnegie Mellon University out in Pittsburgh, where he had the sort of core of his business. You'll find Carnegie libraries. My wife is a librarian, so I'm highly aware of them all over the country. There's hundreds of these things. These little Carnegie libraries at the Carnegie Foundation funded for all these, local towns around America to have their own public libraries, and all sort of funded on Carnegie money. Um, and again, hospitals and other kinds of things like that. Carnegie Hall, right, in New York, sort of a concert hall, for the arts and music and things like that. So sort of movement of philanthropy. Of course, it all carries Carnegie's name, so everybody remembers who paid for it all, and that's another kind of conspicuous consumption. Everybody knows who was the person who was so amazingly rich they could afford to pay for a whole university, hundreds of libraries, a grand concert hall in New York City, and so forth, right? So this is all also part of the dimension. Okay, so that's kind of the upper class. If we move down to the middle class, our professionals, our doctors and lawyers, and our white-collar managers in the factories and railroads and so forth, they're going to have some, similar kinds of things going on. A little bit different. Each has its own sort of, marks. They're not capable of the kind of philanthropy on the scale that that the upper class is. For the middle class, respectability, right, is sort of the key word. You want middle class respectability. You want to be able to say, we're not like those lower class people. You get the same kind of status anxiety of middle class people not, wanting to distinguish themselves, that they don't belong down among the laboring classes. So how are you going to do that? One key thing, something I already mentioned, home ownership. Right, you can't afford the sort of grand multiple mansions and summer homes and things that the upper class can, but you can, own your own home, and that sort of becomes your fortress and your palace, and that's your pride, that you have this home, which is we return to when you leave the office and leave the workplace and go there. So that's going to be one key element, is home ownership, and of course displaying as much there. Within the home, hospitality will become a very important value, because of course the home has to be displayed to other people so that they can see, what you were able to afford, and you spend money on the very hospitality to draw people into it. So that's going to be an important kind of an area. Another thing which is related to the home, remember that one important feature of industrialization was the way that it divorced home and workplace. Right? Back when you had an agricultural economy, the farmstead, was the workplace, was the economic unit. When you had your medieval and early modern merchant class and craftsman class, an early modern banker kind of worked out of an office that was in his house. You would go by, John Hancock, here down in Boston, major Boston banker. You went by his house to do business with him, to do his banking, and that's where he did his banking, was at the Hancock mansion. Likewise, craftsmen would work in a workshop, which was, down on the ground floor of their house, and they sleep upstairs, that kind of a thing. Well, industrialization, the rise of the factory, and therefore also the office, had changed all of that. And now you're going to be moving into, workplaces which are divorced from the home, separate from the home, and the home is going to be left behind as a separate sphere. What does this have to do with middle class respectability? Well, who's going to be in charge of that home, right? And here you're going to get a big gender switch, or a big change in the way that gender relations get ordered. That's going to be very, very, very important. In the old household economies, gender was not equal. We don't have egalitarian societies, anywhere in the pre-modern or early modern period, really. But when the home is the economic unit, then everybody of all genders, and for that matter, all age groups, they've all got their role to play in the household economy. Okay, there's women's work, there's children's work, but everybody's got their piece of the total, labor of the household. Okay, so that's the way the old order had worked. The wife had her, the farm wife had her farm wife work. The man of the house, we went out and pushed the plow and did some of the other kind of outdoor work and stuff. But basically, each still had its own kind of labor that they would do. Under the industrial economy, however, you're still going to get gender division, but it's going to get separated off in a way. The workplace is increasingly going to be the place that the man goes to. Right, the man goes off to the workplace, the man goes to the factory, the man goes to the office, makes the salary, makes the money, brings it home. For the middle class, and we'll talk about the lower class in a minute, for the middle class, one of the major signs of middle class respectability is that the husband's salary is sufficient that the wife does not need to work. And the wife is not, therefore, generally allowed to work. The non-working wife becomes a major symbol of middle class respectability. Okay, and this is a big shift in women's roles. If you sort of think of the comparison between, a 16th century farm wife who's out there, she's plucking the chickens and collecting the eggs and she's got all her jobs to do. The 19th century middle class wife has sort of lost that role. She no longer has an economically productive role, even within the gender constraints that she has. She has to be unproductive. And in fact, it's kind of the whole point for the husband to show that he has an unproductive wife. He doesn't need her to work, and that's going to be an absolutely key point of pride for him, in a sense, and for the family that, that there's a wife who can afford to stay home. What does she do with all her time, sort of sitting in the home? What grows up around the feminine gender is a sense of sentimentality becomes a major theme. She is supposed to become the emotional heart of the family. There's a certain sense that the man's world, the factory world, is cold and amoral. He has to kind of, leave his tender sensibilities behind when he leaves the house to go out into the rough masculine working world. He's going to make harsh decisions out there, and the wife is going to become the sort of guardian of morality, guardian of emotion, guardian of sentimentality, and the home is therefore going to become this sort of shrine, this sanctuary that the man returns to, which has been made beautiful for him and is made pleasant for him, and where you sort of return to a sense of emotional connectedness, in a sense. And so the wife is sort of pushed into this aesthetic role and emotional role, as sort of keeper of that dimension of society there. Part of that is therefore, the wife is going to become involved in, maybe art. We talked about third wave industrialization and consumer goods. Factory built pianos are going to become a very, very, very big deal in the late 19th century. It's the era of the piano, sort of the piano alongside the bicycle, I think I mentioned in another lecture. The piano and the bicycle are sort of, the symbols of the sort of consumer production coming out of factories. These women, they stay at home and they learn to play piano, so that when guests come over, when the husband comes over, she or one of the children, her daughter, whatever, could play piano and entertain the guests and, have this sort of aesthetic, sentimental kind of a world where you have popular music being played there. So the piano becomes a huge kind of a symbol there. So sort of sentimentality. It's going to have a major impact on religion. Actually, by the way, we've talked about religion a fair amount through this course. Religion gets sentimentalized. Religion becomes part of the feminine sphere. Some people have talked about a feminization of the clergy, whereas back in the medieval period and the early modern period, the clergy were definitely masculine and they were part of that kind of patriarchal, dominant place in society. Well, that's going to be, not so much the case anymore. You're going to start moving towards clergy who, they're men normally. You're not going to get ordination of women until well into the 20th century. But who do men in the clergy spend their time with? Who do they talk to? What sort of themes? How do other people think about them? The clergy become kind of feminized. They're hanging around with the women. They're not going into the factories and such necessarily. They're not, dealing with the rough and tumble, man's world. They're rather sort of, hanging around the female world. And, sort of in religion itself becomes kind of sentimentalized. We talked about pietism and evangelicalism having this emotional dimension. That emotional side almost completely takes over, at the expense of traditional institutional authority or doctrine or any of the other, or, sort of the ritual sacramental sense of Christianity, or other religions. Religion comes to be thought of largely as sort of a sentimental, emotional exercise that people engage in. So that's a whole other dimension there. Okay, so sentimentality, religion, the working class, and you're also going to, of course, engage in some conspicuous consumption to show your middle class respectability. You're going to bring art into the home. You may not be able to afford actual paintings by great painters. Maybe you can, maybe you can't, but you'll get prints, things like that, sculptures, flower gardens. A whole other part of it actually also connects into world trade. If you look at what people are consuming, you sort of go into middle class home, you're going to start finding you've got silk ties and kerchiefs. The silk, would have come from Asia. They're drinking tea that often would have come from Asia, or coffee that would have come from Latin America. Spices in their foods, porcelain, again brought from Asia, China, ivory decorations and things like that from Africa or India. So you sort of have this whole extension of European colonialism and imperialism and trade networks abroad sort of becoming embodied in the middle class household. And that's sort of your conspicuous consumption there as well, that you're drinking tea from porcelain cups and these other things which are not indigenous to Europe, so to speak. They're sort of being imported from overseas. Okay, so that's a dimension there. And then working class. Now let's think about the working class. As we said, very vulnerable. Not owning a home, working class, generally living, on the threshold. It depends on where exactly you are, and what the current conditions are, but, in that very vulnerable kind of situation. Not generally capable of much conspicuous consumption, although they will when they can, if times are good and they can afford, a little bit of a luxury to bring into the house, or, even a nice, print or something to put up on the wall of their tenement to make it a little less grim. They would do that. Um, the working class families generally cannot afford to live on a single income, right? The income itself, the wages are not high enough, and as we said, they're very vulnerable. So you tend to carry over more of the old peasant farm sensibility that everybody works, everybody's got their role to do, everybody has to contribute. Because of that, in the laboring classes, unlike the middle class, you will have women working. Sometimes, initially, especially in the factories, a lot of factories actually preferred hiring women for a variety of reasons. Later, it shifted over into hiring more men, but certain industries like the textile industry in particular, you're going to keep having a lot of a lot of feminine workers for quite a while, seamstresses and weavers and such, until quite a ways later on. And you're going to have children working. Um, Early industrialization, a lot of children going into the factories with their parents, taking on jobs that required small fingers. And, they're not keeping the money from it for themselves. The families are living on it, and you sort of, you'll have the children working, you'll have the parents working, the mother and father both working in the factory. And if someone gets laid off or hours get cut back, then hopefully somebody else in the family is still bringing something in, and you manage to survive on this as you get along. Obviously, you're going to get concern over time, especially over the children's work and the dangers they're exposed to with the machinery. So there's going to be government reform movements to start banning child labor, start introducing compulsory public education, things like that. Those will gradually develop over the 19th century. The whole life of the working class raises one major question, which is the sort of urban squalor question, right? How bad were their lives? Obviously, they're not anywhere near as prosperous or well off as the middle class or upper class kind of people are. But how bad are they? Really, how about our lives altogether? The traditional interpretation is that it's very, very, very bad. That the sort of tenements they're living in are sheer squalor and filth and overcrowded. That there's all sorts of malnutrition and disease and just horrible, horrible conditions that they're living in all the time. Um, some of the more recent scholarship has started to question that. Basically, it's a couple of different things. One is the nature of the sources that you build your impressions out of, and the other is the framework of what you use for your point of reference. Um, in terms of the sort of nature of the sources, what scholars have started to draw attention to is a lot of the evidence for this kind of urban squalor model is based on writings by middle class or upper class kinds of people. Naturally, they're more educated, they've got more leisure time to go, write books and things like that. And so when some of them, with the highest moral intentions, your Charles Dickenses and so forth, with every, intended sympathy and moral motivation, but when they look at the lives of the lower class, in these new cities, they find themselves sort of face to face with the lower class in a way they didn't used to be out in the countryside when they used to, sort of live in the manor house and the peasants were down in their village somewhere and you never really went down there. In the city environments, everybody's sort of packed closer together. The upper classes get a much closer up look at how the lower classes live, and those of more tender sensibilities or higher moral principles are rather shocked by it. Just how different their lives are and how lacking they are in the kinds of comforts and satisfactions that the middle class and upper class take for granted. So there may be a certain amount of exaggeration or a certain amount of sort of expressing moral outrage and shock at the lives of the lower class because it's upper class people looking at it and describing it and sort of not really, not completely understanding or sympathizing maybe with what all is going on in those lower class neighborhoods. The other thing, as far as I'd say, like frame of reference, is what are you going to compare the lives of the lower class to and their conditions of life to? A lot of what's going on here is, again, based on those sources, comparing the life of the lower class to the life of the middle class, and obviously not having home ownership and living in much smaller, more crowded kind of conditions does look quite a bit um, looks pretty negative. But some would argue that if you look at it chronologically, if you compare the urban working class in their living quarters to what they used to live in back when their ancestors were peasants, and largely they were, these are largely, peasant families that moved into the city to take the factory jobs, um, then it doesn't necessarily look all that bad. If you sort of compare your peasant cottage, which was often not even built to be able to remain standing for years on end. Sort of the studies of medieval villages and early modern villages show that they would build these quite rickety cottages that would typically collapse after maybe a decade or so, and you just build another one, and they sort of went up very easily and fell down very easily, and that was routine. They were quite small, quite crowded beforehand. In other words, by sort of tangible measurements of things like the durability of the homes, square footage that people have to live in per capita, things like that, it turns out that although the cities are putting larger numbers of people, close together, obviously, may actually have a little bit more space to live in, at least as far as indoor living space, compared to what they used to have to do. And likewise, there are other measurements. If you look at things like health, if you look at things like life expectancy, those are all going up. The population is growing for a reason, and it's growing because people are living longer. They're not getting sick as much. They're not being as underfed as they had been previously. So, there may actually be some indications that although the life of the urban working class was no picnic and in fact was pretty harsh, it may not have been as harsh as it used to be back when their ancestors were peasants on the farms. You don't see a lot of um, complaints from the working class saying they wish they could go back and be peasants again. That's not really, they're looking for improvement in their conditions, and rightly so. But it's not that, unless they romanticize it or no longer remember it, they're not wanting to necessarily go back and live like 16th century peasants used to do. You could take it one way or the other. That none of that is intended to romanticize or whitewash the lives of the urban middle classes, but there is at least some indication there that you can see it different ways. Okay. Finally, other area is this all gives rise to the birth of popular culture, and that's going to be something very significant. If we think about the arts, visual arts, performing arts, especially things like music and dance and so forth, theater. Um, in the early modern era, um, all access to these kinds of cultural manifestations had been extremely limited. There were a few theaters in the big cities, Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London and so forth, but the vast majority of people in early modern society had very limited access to anything you could call art. To a musical performance or things. You might have a village fiddler or something, but not a whole lot, and he would have had a very limited repertoire. Um, Not to mention, visual arts or theater shows or anything like that. So only, a small privileged number of people, usually in, much smaller urban centers, which included a much smaller percentage of the population, ever would have had access, excuse me, to such things in the early modern period. Industrialization changes that a lot. What's happening is, let me also say other thing. From the Middle Ages down through the early modern period, down to the 1700s, artists, musicians, sculptors, and so forth, singers, were normally supported through patronage. That is to say, you would have very wealthy noblemen or very wealthy churchmen, and they would take in these kinds of people, artistic people, on retainer to be sort of supported on their patronage. It was part of the prestige of the nobility and of the church to be able to present music, to be able to present art, and have it, within their own class. A kind of a conspicuous consumption of their own to be able to have this. Okay, so patronage had been the main mode. You weren't selling tickets to a concert or anything like that. Rather, you found a position in the household of a great nobleman in exchange for, you painting and him getting to hang up your paintings around his palace or what have you. You got to eat at his table and, got a suit of clothing and, got taken care of, right? That's sort of the patronage model. Um, Industrialization changes that, especially because of urbanization and because of the shifts in the economy. Urbanization, you've now got much, much larger populations, a much higher percentage of the population packed together in these cities, people living fairly close together. It also means that people are living middle class people on salaries, working class people on wages. And what that means, even for the working class, if times are not too hard and if you're careful and scrape together, you can have a bit of money left over for a Saturday night after you've paid your rent and fed your family, hopefully, right? And middle class, much easier, to sort of set aside a portion of your salary, which means it's now possible for these people to start spending money on culture, things to entertain themselves with, amuse themselves with. And this really marks a huge shift in the way creative enterprises are going to work. It's going to mean a move away from patronage, and instead you're increasingly going to see artistic culture, taking form or manifesting itself in sort of public venues which are really serving a broader public, right? A broader ticket buying public in most cases, right? And so this gives rise to the music hall, gives rise to the urban ballet. Sometimes there's a bit of a meeting in the middle. The conspicuous consumption of the nobility kind of translates into the philanthropy of the new capitalist class. Like I say, a guy like Andrew Carnegie will put up the capital necessary to build, a Carnegie Hall, great sort of, music hall, so that then it's kind of subsidized for a ticket buying public to be able to purchase, the right to go in there and have a seat where they'll be able to go and hear, an opera sung or, a concert given by a great symphony or pianist or something like that, right? So sort of a combination of patronage and ticket buying in some cases, down to outright commercial enterprises of sort of music halls and dance halls and things like that start popping up all over the place in the 19th century. So this is really a big shift in the way that the economy is going to work as far as supporting the arts and the kind of art getting produced, right? You start getting popular art produced. You're going to start getting songs being written. You don't have recording technology until the end of the third industrial process. We'll talk about that later on. But even without recording technology, you still have the possibility of, people going down to the music halls. Sheet music is getting printed up. Wives at home are learning to play it on piano. This sort of becomes a whole popular kind of a thing. Popular songs start going around the music hall, and you start getting a celebrity culture emerging, right? It starts becoming possible for an actor or a singer or musician, virtuoso pianist or violinist or somebody like that, to go and sort of become famous, as sort of the best pianist in town, and everybody wants to go down and hear when they're performing. And then sometimes it even gets to the point they could go on tour, and you'll start having these performance tours where a pianist, Chopin he's from Poland, one of the kind of main examples of this, where he goes on tour, goes from major industrial city to major industrial city, goes to all the great symphony halls created by the philanthropy of the capitalist class and the ticket buying public, middle class, and maybe some of the better off working class people buying tickets to go on and see this guy perform. And and a guy like Chopin is very dramatic, very romantic. He's got hair. Here we go, long hair. Flying and sort of playing very dramatically on the piano, and it's all very electrifying and exciting. And people get thrilled by this kind of thing, and people like to start becoming celebrities. So that's a huge dimension here going on with the performing arts. Okay, so that, like I say, birth of popular culture, popular theater, popular music, popular art, things like that starting to come out. Museums coming up that people can go in and, see the art being displayed and buy a print to take home and hang up on their wall, stuff like that, right? So a whole lot of things going on in the artistic sphere. And that's an occasion I should talk about one thing that I didn't really talk about before. It's connected to the ideologies I did, and this is what I'll end on, and that's Romanticism. Um, Romanticism is a new cultural movement. It's appearing about simultaneously with industry. It's a movement over against the old Enlightenment philosophical ideas. Remember, the Enlightenment had been based all around sort of the supremacy of reason, right? Human reason is the key thing, which is most important. Thomas Paine and Rene Descartes, people like that. Um, Romantic thinkers, probably one of the earliest is the poet Goethe, writing in Germany, but you get romantic writers and artists and musicians cropping up all over Europe pretty rapidly. They really react against this. They feel this focus of the Enlightenment on reason has produced a way of culture that's sort of too dry, too dead, doesn't really tap into sort of the deepest, most important things about human life. It's not human enough. And so over against reason, romantics tend to put the spirit, right? And by the spirit, they mean something which manifests itself in the emotions, kind of an inner self, which defies reason, defies the ability to be put neatly into rationalized, statements, but instead has to be felt. The feelings, the sentiments a person has, the sort of deep, profound sense of self or sense of meaning, is what's going to take priority. Excuse me, over against the sort of dry, rational, scientific calculations of the Enlightenment types. Okay, so that's sort of the Romantic movement. You get Romantic philosophy, right, stressing this kind of idea, sort of the human soul partaking of the infinite, in a sense, various ideas like that. It tends to have a very individualistic strain to it, right, because if you're talking about the almost inexpressible depths of the soul, that's going to be something that's very personal and very individual, and not subject to, you can express it in a poem or in a piece of artwork or something, but each person is going to have their own, and there's always going to be a bit of a deep self which is hidden from other people around you. It's not like the Enlightenment world where everybody can sort of discuss their ideas and dispense with anything irrational like that. Romanticism has this deep individualistic tone to it. I would argue, I think that, and I don't think it's maybe been acknowledged enough in the scholarship, I think that there's a strong background to Romanticism back in Pietism. Pietism, and perhaps in the English-speaking world, evangelicalism, because they had sort of, in a religious sphere, introduce this sort of high priority being given to the very personal, the very individual, the very emotional connection, in that case, as sort of as a religious devotion to God. In a sense, what the Romantics do is take that kind of pietistic sensibility and secularize it. They may or may not connect it to God. They tend to detach a bit from traditional religiosity. They may talk about sort of a spirit of the universe, or, they may go kind of deistic in a sense and kind of talk about a supreme being out there in some sense. But for them, the supreme being is not the sort of, nice, benevolent, sunshiny, rational thing that creates the world. It's more the sort of deep, inexpressible, strangeness that sort of, gives rise to, the profound depths of the spirit. So that sort of captures the Romantic sensibility. The other thing about Romanticism is that, however, it can also take on a collective quality. It can link into nationalism very neatly, because while you can talk about the spirit of an individual, which is known only to themselves and difficult for others to really comprehend, you can also start talking, and many Romantics do, about the spirit of a nation, right? Once you get this sort of political ideology around nationhood, then people start talking about the spirit of nations. You get a really strong interest in things like folklore, folk songs, stories being told. In Germany, the Grimm brothers, you may have heard of Grimm's fairy tales. There's actually a pair of brothers in the early 1800s. They're influenced by Romanticism. They're influenced by nationalism. And they get the idea that the German spirit, they sort of obsessed with being German. German spirit is maybe best captured not in the writings of literary elites, but in the stories getting told by mothers and grandmothers and nurses to sort of, children in the nursery kind of thing. So they go around collecting these stories with the idea these stories have been passed down for generations and generations and centuries and go back to the deep, mysterious past of the German people, and these are the purest expression of the Germanic spirit. So sort of Grimm's fairy tales. You get similar things going on in a lot of other countries. People sort of going around collecting folklore, folk songs, stories, all these kinds of things, and trying to sort of capture the national spirit. So Romanticism and nationalism will link up different ways. And finally, this brings us back around to where I was talking about with performing artists in particular, also visual artists. You wind up with Romanticism sort of providing the cultural rationale for a lot of this art. Naturally, art becomes the main avenue for expressing your romantic sense of your inner spirit. This deep, profound, inexpressible self you're trying to find a way to give expression to. But you're also going to run into a problem, though, because precisely because it's so difficult to express, you're also, though, trying to get across to a ticket-buying public in the New World, right? So you get this sort of this is where you first start getting a sense of the tension between the sort of artistic vision of the individual trying to express his own unique, almost prophetic kind of a sense, but also the desire to get that message across to an audience, get the audience to buy tickets, to allow the artist to be able to support himself financially. So you get this kind of romantic vision of the starving artist, the guy who is trying to pursue his art, but is not understood by anybody. Nobody buys his tickets. Nobody buys his art. That kind of a thing. The hero of the age, the celebrity of the age, comes to be the person who has credibility, kind of the street cred, that they haven't sold out. They haven't just, produced stuff for the masses. They're still maintaining true to their artistic vision, and yet they're still appealing to the masses. The masses get what they're doing and like what they're trying to do. Chopin, I was talking about as a classic example. Beethoven's a classic example. Beethoven is a romantic composer, continues to have this reputation, this aura of the true romantic, the sort of, tormented soul with a deep inner vision that he's trying to communicate through his music. But everybody loves it. Everybody loves Beethoven's symphonies and sonatas and are, consuming it. And Beethoven makes an awful lot of money doing this, but really hard to maintain that balance, to become popular and sell tickets while still maintaining, this sort of unique artistic vision you're supposed to have. Very different from the old idea of the artist. The word art itself originally means craft. And, back in Shakespeare's time and earlier, the sense of the artist was he was basically, um, the guy, paint a house, you paint.
Just think about it. Now you get this idea that no, the person who's making a painting is a different being than the person who just paints a house. He's not just slapping color on something, he's actually expressing something. He's expressing a spirit, and that's important. And then finally, last thing coming off this whole idea of romanticism in the arts in particular, you're also going to see the rise of the avant-garde, right? Those who do not sell out, so to speak. And it becomes very important to these people to make the point that they're not selling out. They're doing something different. They're doing something that the ordinary people will not get. And this is also going to have an economic dimension to it, right? You're going to start having isms associated with artistic movements, retroactively applied, back to the Renaissance and things, but, sort of all the new isms where people are going to write manifestos about the kind of art they're going to make in order to lay out this romantic vision of what they're doing and then, try and produce art that fits that. So you start getting impressionism and expressionism and, eventually, Dadaism and Cubism and all these various other isms going on in the art movement as though they were political philosophies or ideologies. And that's going to, in some ways, mark a reversion in art back to the patronage model, right? Um, the avant-garde artists are producing art that is deliberately and conspicuously not for the masses, not for mass consumption, not for the ticket-buying public. The ordinary person in the street doesn't get it, and that's purposeful. They're not supposed to. But it's something which is going to become something that a upper class person, right, a member of the elite, can mark himself as being one of the people who are in the know, as sort of, superior to the ordinary flock of human beings because they patronize the avant-garde artists. They buy their art at exorbitant prices and sort of, support these avant-garde artists in these kinds of ways. So you get this, at the same time as you get a lot of separations of other things, you also get the separation of popular art, newly emerging, becoming truly popular and of the population in a way had never been the case before, but also separating off on that avant-garde art, which is not just for the elite because the elite are the only people who can afford art. Now everybody can afford art in some form, but which is deliberately not intended for the consumption of the public, is only intended for the consumption of elites. Okay, so that's been about an hour. I will stop there and we will pick up in the future. Thank you.